Aaliyah Thompson had flown first class more times than she could count. But nothing prepared her for the moment a stranger looked at her skin, her age, her size, and decided she didn't belong. Before she could even speak, a seat was stolen, assumptions were made, and whispers spread to the cabin. And in the span of a few seconds, a quiet trip turned into a storm of prejudice that would bring an entire flight to a standstill. What happened on that plane would expose an ugly truth far bigger than a missing seat. But if Aaliyah had known what was coming next, she might have braced herself for the fallout that was about to begin. At just 11 years old, Aaliyah Thompson moved to the world with a quiet confidence that came from a life far bigger than most people her age could imagine. Long before she stepped onto that plane, her days were filled with foundation events, school debates, and meetings where her father, one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in the world, taught her how to navigate spaces that weren't built with people like them in mind. Wealth wasn't new to her. Discrimination, unfortunately, wasn't either. Traveling first class had become routine, almost boring, a simple part of moving between schools, offices, and family homes scattered across continents. She was used to curious looks, lingering stares, and people trying to figure out how someone so young, so small, so black, could possibly belong in spaces reserved for society's elite. Still, Aaliyah held herself with grace. Her upbringing had taught her not just how to carry luxury, but how to carry dignity. Each trip was another reminder of her father's belief that presence itself was a form of power. She walked onto Flight 457, expecting nothing more than a quiet journey home, a moment of rest before another whirlwind week. But sometimes racism doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it waits, silent and smug, hidden behind pressed suits and polite smiles. Sometimes it strikes in the most ordinary moments, when everything feels normal until it isn't. As Aaliyah stepped into the first-class cabin that day, she sensed something shift, just a whisper of tension, a shadow of judgment in the air, though she couldn't yet see where it was coming from. If she had known what awaited her just a few steps ahead, she would have realized her calm flight was about to turn into a battle she never asked for, but one she was more than ready to win. Aaliyah stepped into the first-class cabin, expecting nothing more than a quiet journey, but the moment she reached her row, the atmosphere shifted. A white businessman, sharp suit, sharp jaw, and an even sharper sense of entitlement, was planted in her window seat as if it had been carved just for him. She approached with the same politeness she used in boardrooms and charity events, holding her boarding pass steady, hoping this would be a simple misunderstanding. But the man didn't even bother to look at it. His eyes skimmed over her, young, black, barely tall enough for her feet to touch the floor, and he dismissed her with a flick of his hand, telling her to head back where she belonged. The words hit her like cold water, slicing through the cabin air. A few passengers looked up, waiting to see if she would shrink, apologize, or back away. But Aaliyah stood her ground, steady and unwavering. Still, the man doubled down, speaking louder, his tone dripping with superiority, drawing a spotlight onto her that she never asked for. His comments sharpened, growing bolder as he felt the weight of his own privilege behind him. He insisted she couldn't possibly afford a seat like this, that children didn't belong up front, that she must have made some sort of mistake. With each accusation, the cabin grew quieter, tension thickening like fog. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others stared without blinking, and a few began discreetly recording, sensing the moment was spiraling into something far uglier than a simple seating dispute. Aaliyah tried again, calmly presenting her ticket, but before she could finish, a flight attendant arrived. Relief flickered through her for a split second, until the attendant's eyes drifted past her and softened toward the man instead. The woman's tone was thinly veiled with condescension as she asked Aaliyah for her boarding pass, examining it far longer than necessary, as though searching for proof that the girl standing before her wasn't who the ticket claimed she was. When she finally turned to the man to request his pass as well, he refused outright, and shockingly, the attendant accepted it without protest. Instead of addressing the blatant noncompliance, she suggested moving Aaliyah to another seat to avoid conflict, as if the problem was Aaliyah's presence, not the racism dripping from the man's words. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. Others nodded in quiet agreement with the attendant's suggestion. And standing there, alone in the aisle, Aaliyah felt the familiar sting of being judged before she was even heard. It wasn't just a man's insults anymore. It was the weight of the system leaning against her, pressing her into a place she refused to return to. Then the man stood up, towering over her, using height and volume like weapons. In a voice sharpened by entitlement, he said phrases that made passengers stiffen, remarks about people like her, about knowing her place, about where black children belonged on planes. His words were a direct strike, echoing generations of prejudice in a single breath. The humiliation washed through her, but beneath it burned something far stronger, resolve. She lifted her chin, met his stare without flinching, and spoke with a calmness that startled even him. She reminded him she had the rightful seat, and that refusing to move didn't make him right. It made him exposed. He sneered, laughing in her face, telling her there was nothing she could do. But Aaliyah didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his aggression. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and made a call, one that instantly changed the energy in the cabin. Passengers leaned in. The flight attendant paled, and the man shifted, suddenly unsure. Aaliyah spoke clearly into the phone, informing her father, one of the most influential businessmen in the country, of exactly what was happening, naming the man who had taken her seat, recounting the racist remarks, and explaining how the crew had handled the situation. Each word tightened the air like a pulled string. The passenger who had mocked her began to sweat. The flight attendant's smile cracked. The cabin went silent as Aaliyah ended the call with a simple, steady message. Her father was contacting the airline's corporate office immediately. She slipped her phone back into her bag with the same poise she walked onto plane with. Only now, every eye in first class was glued to her, and as the businessman realized the magnitude of what it just triggered, his confidence finally began to crumble. If he had known what Aaliyah's next move would lead to, he might have given up that seat without a single word. But now, it was far too late. The cabin felt frozen in time as Aaliyah lowered her phone, the quiet click of the call ending echoing louder than any shouting match could have. It was the moment the balance of power shifted. Yet the man who had mocked, belittled, and dismissed her still hadn't realized just how deeply he had crossed the line. Within minutes, flight attendants huddled near the galley, whispering urgently as word spread that corporate had been contacted directly by Marcus Thompson himself. A ripple of unease moved through the crew. They all knew his name. They knew his influence. And now, they knew his daughter was standing alone in the aisle, subjected to racial humiliation while they had failed to protect her. The captain appeared next, stern-faced and confused, clearly summoned by the panicked flight attendants. The tension in the cabin snapped as he approached, assessing the cluster of passengers, the frozen businessman in the stolen seat, and Aaliyah standing tall despite the weight of every eye on her. Passengers were whispering now, some in support, some in disbelief, and others in guilt as they realized her silence had been its own kind of violence. The man who had taunted her began to grasp the severity of the situation as the captain requested his boarding pass with a firmness no one had used until now. His pockets went suddenly empty, his confidence drained. His excuses collapsed under the scrutiny of authority he could no longer manipulate. Cameras recorded as he stuttered through half-formed explanations, his earlier insults replaced by a trembling desperation that revealed the truth. He had never belonged in that seat. As his lies fell apart, corporate's message arrived through the captain's earpiece. The atmosphere thickened with shock as the captain listened, his expression darkening with every second. The instruction was clear: immediate removal of the disruptive passenger. Full report filed, and the crew required to cooperate with an internal investigation into racial misconduct. And then came the moment that sealed everything. The captain informed the businessman that the flight was now officially grounded until the situation was resolved. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in disbelief. An entire aircraft delayed, not because of weather, not because of mechanical issues, but because of one man's racist entitlement and his refusal to move from a seat that never belonged to him. Security arrived swiftly, stepping into the aisle with practiced precision. The businessman, who had once towered over Aaliyah, now shrank into himself, eyes darting around the cabin as reality bore down on him. Every passenger watched as he was escorted out. No privilege protecting him, no arrogance left to wield. But the weight of the climax didn't fall on him alone. As he was removed, Aaliyah felt the full emotional force of what she had endured, standing small in the aisle yet carrying the burden of a prejudice that had targeted generations before her. The flight attendant who had sided against her avoided her gaze, guilt stiffening her posture. She knew the investigation would include her actions. She knew her choices had consequences. And though Aaliyah didn't need to say a word, her presence alone delivered the message. Silence in the face of injustice is its own form of harm. The cabin was quiet as Aaliyah finally stepped into her rightful seat, not with triumph, but with a calm strength that made every witness rethink what they had just seen. For a moment, the aircraft held its breath, shaken, exposed, and forced to confront the reality of what prejudice looks like when it plays out in front of dozens of onlookers. Yet the story wasn't over. The flight was grounded. The corporate investigation was just beginning, and the world outside that cabin had no idea what just happened, but it soon would, because the true impact of this moment was only just beginning to unfold, and what came next would echo far beyond that airplane. As Aaliyah settled into her rightful seat, the cabin slowly exhaled, the tension melting into a mix of awe, relief, and lingering shame. The businessman had been removed, the flight grounded, and the crew now fully aware of the consequences of allowing bias to dictate their actions. But the moment left more than just procedural fallout. It left an indelible mark on everyone present. Passengers whispered among themselves, many shaken, many reflecting on their own assumptions in silence in the face of injustice. For Aaliyah, it was a quiet victory, not one of gloating but of affirmation. That dignity, calm authority, and knowledge of one's worth could dismantle prejudice in real time. Yet the story extended far beyond that airplane. It was a reminder that racial bias persists in the most mundane spaces, in the assumptions people make without thinking, and in the systems that quietly protect those who feel entitled to power. Aaliyah's experience was proof that injustice doesn't always wear a dramatic mask. It can appear in the casual dismissals, the sideways glances, the unchallenged words that chip away at equity. But it also showed the power of standing firm, of refusing to let prejudice define your place in the world. The cabin had witnessed more than a seat dispute. It had witnessed a lesson in courage and accountability, and in the quiet but unstoppable force of black excellence. And as the plane finally lifted off, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen unfold. How many more flights, offices, schools, and streets still need to be reminded that respect, fairness, and justice are not optional, and that those who underestimate others because of race or age will one day learn the hard way who truly holds the power?